A plane leaves Tehran before most of the world even knows it took off. Its destination is Muscat, Oman. Its passenger is Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, and the timing could not be more dangerous. This is happening right now. On the very same weekend, the fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran nearly collapsed for good. Just days ago, Trump declared the U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding over. Strikes resumed almost immediately. Nearly 90 Iranian targets were hit in a single American operation. Iran responded with drones and missiles fired at Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. For a moment, it looked like the region was sliding straight back into full-scale war. And then, quietly, a single flight to Oman became the last thread holding everything together. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed the trip through a short statement. Officials described it as part of ongoing bilateral consultations between Iran and Oman. The stated purpose was simple on paper. Discuss the Strait of Hormuz. Discuss the safety of ships trying to pass through it. But nothing about this moment is simple. This is the same strait where Iranian attacks on commercial tankers just triggered the collapse of the ceasefire in the first place. 3 ships were hit while transiting those waters. 1 flagged from the Marshall Islands, 1 flagged from Saudi Arabia, 1 flagged from Liberia. The United States and its Gulf allies blamed Iran directly for all 3 attacks. Within hours, American strikes hit Iranian military infrastructure across the country. Aerospace facilities in Bushehr, port infrastructure in Chabahar, transportation and logistics sites in Golestan province, facilities near Iran-Shar Airport in the southeast. Iranian state media reported a firefighter killed in the strikes on the airport's operations building. This was not a symbolic exchange. This was a war reigniting in real time, and it's in the middle of that reignited war that Araghchi boarded a plane for Oman. According to Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Baghaei, the visit is a continuation of consultations that started 1 or 2 months earlier. He said the foreign ministers would discuss establishing mechanisms to ensure the safe passage of ships through Hormuz. On the surface, that sounds procedural. Underneath it, the stakes could not be higher, because if this diplomatic channel breaks down completely, there may be nothing left standing between the region and a wider war. Trump has already said the Memorandum of Understanding is over, but in the same breath, he said talks with Iran would continue. That contradiction is the entire story right now. One side of Washington is threatening escalation. The other side is still quietly working the phones, trying to keep any diplomatic thread alive. Senior U.S. officials say they expect Tehran to publicly declare the Strait of Hormuz open again. They want a clear statement that commercial ships crossing it will not be attacked. So far, that statement has not come. Instead, Iran's chief negotiator has pushed back hard. Araghchi accused the United States directly of violating the memorandum's own terms. In a post on social media, he claimed Washington broke a specific clause tied to Iran's nuclear program. That clause states Iran must maintain the current status of its nuclear program. It also states the U.S. will not impose new sanctions or deploy additional forces in the region. Araghchi claims that promise has already been broken. He directly named the U.S. Treasury Secretary as the one violating it. Iran's foreign ministry also firmly denied that Tehran had ever requested new negotiations with Washington. That denial matters because it directly contradicts earlier American claims. Both sides, it seems, are publicly disagreeing on the most basic facts of their own diplomacy. And that disagreement is happening while military strikes are still fresh on both sides. Meanwhile, a separate and equally important condition sits at the center of any real deal. A senior U.S. official told reporters plainly that any final agreement must include the U.S. obtaining Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. He put it bluntly. "If we don't get the dust," he said, "we do not have a deal with Iran." That single sentence captures the entire deadlock. Iran has enriched uranium up to 60% purity. That is dangerously close to weapons-grade material. The U.S. wants it removed, diluted, or handed over entirely. Iran has signaled some flexibility, but only if all sanctions are lifted in return. Neither side has agreed to make the first move. And while the diplomats argue over uranium stockpiles and strait access, ordinary shipping through Hormuz remains dangerously uncertain. According to maritime intelligence group Lloyd's List, no large vessels have transited the safer southern shipping route near Oman's coast, with their location transponders switched on since the attacks resumed. A CBS News review of open-source tracking data found the same thing. No commercial ships appear willing to risk the crossing openly right now. Insurance markets have reacted just as sharply. War risk premiums for vessels crossing Hormuz are now recalculated hour by hour instead of day by day. At the height of recent strikes, insurance costs for some ships spiked to roughly 10% of the vessel's total value. Before this war, that number sat closer to 0.25%. That is the kind of shift that can quietly strangle global trade without a single new missile being fired. This is the pressure Araghchi is walking into in Muscat. Oman is not a neutral bystander in this story either. It has spent years as the primary mediator between Washington and Tehran. Oman's foreign minister, Sayed Badr al-Busaidi, has hosted round after round of indirect U.S.-Iran talks going back to early last year. He has been the trusted go-between when direct contact between the two governments becomes politically impossible. That is exactly the role Oman is playing again this weekend, because right now there's no confirmed direct contact between American and Iranian officials. Every conversation is happening through intermediaries, Oman on one side, Pakistan on another, Qatar working quietly in the background as well. It's a diplomatic relay race. With each country passing messages, neither side is willing to deliver directly. Pakistan's involvement runs especially deep. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, held a phone call with Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif just before Araghchi's trip to Oman. Pezeshkian told him that any sustainable agreement requires mutual respect and practical commitment to obligations. He accused the United States and Israel of violating their own commitments first. Sharif responded with visible concern over the risk of renewed escalation. He stressed the need for continued diplomacy and restraint. He said Pakistan would keep playing its role in reducing tensions, alongside Qatar and other regional mediators. This is not the first time Pakistan has stepped into this exact position. Pakistan helped broker the original memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and Iran back in June. That 14-point agreement created a formal ceasefire. It was meant to open 60 days of structured talks to resolve everything from the Strait of Hormuz to Iran's nuclear program. In practice, only 2 rounds of direct, high-level talks have happened since then. Lower-level technical negotiations continued quietly in the background, until this week's strikes blew the process wide open again. Now, that same fragile framework is the only thing anyone is trying to save. Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister, Ishaq Dar, spoke directly with Saudi Arabia's foreign minister over the weekend as well. The two exchanged views on the latest developments and expressed deep concern over the sudden escalation. Both sides agreed that renewed conflict serves no one's interest. They stressed that mediation efforts need time and space to actually work. That message, more than anything else, defines the mood across the region right now. Nobody wants to be blamed for letting this collapse completely, but nobody is willing to back down first either. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, has struck a far harder public tone than the diplomats around him. He stated plainly that Iran is prepared for what he called all-out defense if the United States breaks the memorandum entirely. That is not the language of a country quietly seeking compromise. It's the language of a government preparing for the possibility that diplomacy fails completely. And that tension between quiet diplomatic corridors and public declarations of defiance is exactly what makes this weekend so unpredictable. On one hand, you have a foreign minister flying to Oman to talk about shipping lanes. On the other, you have a parliament speaker publicly promising all-out defense. Both of those things are true at the exact same time inside the exact same government. Meanwhile, in Washington, the diplomatic math looks just as complicated. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman spoke directly with Trump by phone this weekend. According to an official readout, the two reviewed cooperation between their countries and discussed ways to strengthen it further. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also spoke separately with Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan. Their call focused on what was described as the importance of close coordination to promote regional security. Every one of these calls is happening in parallel with Araghchi's trip to Oman. It's not one negotiation, it's dozens of overlapping conversations, each one trying to prevent the same outcome. A full collapse back into open war. So where does that leave things as Araghchi lands in Muscat? Officially, the visit is framed as routine, a continuation of technical discussions about maritime safety. Unofficially, it's landing at the most volatile moment this ceasefire has faced since it was first signed. If this round of talks produces even a partial breakthrough, it could be the thread that pulls the region back from the edge. If it produces nothing, the alternative is already sitting right there waiting. More strikes, more retaliation, more warnings arriving just before the next escalation. The same pattern that has defined this entire war since February. Trump has said the memorandum is over, but that talks continue. Iran says it never asked for new negotiations, while quietly sending its foreign minister to the one mediator both sides still trust. Oman is hosting a conversation neither Washington nor Tehran will admit is happening on the record. And underneath all of it, tankers sit motionless outside the Strait of Hormuz, waiting to see if this quiet diplomatic gamble actually pays off. This is not a headline about a routine diplomatic visit. This is the last visible attempt to keep a war from restarting in full, playing out in real time, in a country most people can't even place on a map. Whatever happens in that meeting room in Muscat this weekend may end up mattering more than any single airstrike that's happened so far. Because airstrikes can be repeated. Diplomatic trust, once it fully breaks, is far harder to rebuild. And right now, that trust is being tested in real time, one quiet phone call and one quiet flight at a time. The next few days will show whether this moment becomes the turning point that pulled the region back from disaster, or just another entry in a long list of talks that failed to hold. Either way, The world is watching a foreign minister land in Oman, knowing that what happens next may decide whether this war stays contained or spreads even further than it already has. To understand why this single flight matters so much, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually means to the entire planet. Before this war started, roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade passed through those narrow waters. Close to 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas moved through it as well. About 3,000 vessels use the strait every single month. The moment this war began, that traffic didn't just slow down, it nearly vanished. World Trade Organization data shows a 95% reduction in ships carrying crude oil to and from Persian Gulf ports since the war started. LNG shipments dropped by 99%. For a choke point that once carried a fifth of the planet's energy trade, that is not a disruption. That is a near total shutdown. The ripple effects hit almost instantly. Oil prices surged from around $70 a barrel before the war to an average of over $100 a barrel within weeks. Parts of Asia that depend heavily on Gulf oil faced fuel shortages and rationing. Global growth forecasts were downgraded across the board. And in the middle of all that economic damage, two countries quietly came out ahead. The United States saw a revenue increase of roughly $50 billion in oil exports during the opening months of the war. Russia, largely insulated from the shipping bottlenecks, saw a steady rise in exports too, worth more than $15 billion in extra revenue. Iran itself, strangely enough, also saw a short-term revenue boost, collecting tolls from ships willing to pay for safe passage under its own controlled system. Everyone else in the Gulf simply lost. Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE all saw their export revenues decline, unable to avoid the strait the way Saudi Arabia and Oman could through alternate pipelines and coastlines. War, it turns out, rarely distributes its costs evenly. And this particular war has quietly reshaped who wins and who loses in the global energy market, long before most people were paying attention. That's the economic backdrop Aragchi is negotiating inside. But there's a deeper layer to this story too, one involving countries far outside the Middle East entirely. Russia and China have both used this conflict to reshape their own global standing. When the United Nations tried to pass a resolution calling for the strait to reopen and for international forces to help secure it, Russia and China vetoed it outright. They argued the resolution unfairly blamed Iran and risked justifying further military escalation. Both countries hold permanent seats and permanent veto power on the UN Security Council. Their veto effectively blocked any international military authorization to force the strait back open. Iran's ambassador praised the decision. The United States and France condemned it. China, in particular, has tried to walk a careful line throughout this entire war. Its foreign ministry called for an immediate end to hostilities early on, while also warning against what it called indiscriminate use of force. At the same time, China has deep economic ties across the Gulf and depends heavily on the Strait of Hormuz for its own energy imports. So Beijing has spent months trying to look like a responsible global mediator, without ever fully siding against Iran. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has held direct calls with Aragchi throughout the crisis, at one point calling for navigation through Hormuz to be, in his words, properly handled. Chinese state media has gone even further, framing the entire war as evidence that American military power isn't what it used to be. One widely read opinion piece in China's state-run Global Times compared the situation to the Suez Crisis, a moment that marked the decline of British imperial power decades ago. The argument being made is provocative, that this war may be doing something similar to America's global standing right now. Whether or not that comparison holds up, it tells you how closely the rest of the world is watching this exact moment. Even smaller details reveal how far this war's economic reach extends. Just one day before Aragchi's flight to Oman, China restricted exports of helium, a resource critical for manufacturing computer chips. Directly citing the pressure this war has placed on global supply chains. That's how far the shockwaves from a shipping dispute in the Persian Gulf are traveling, all the way into the semiconductor industry on the other side of the planet. Meanwhile, back in the region itself, the diplomatic history behind this exact moment goes back much further than most people realize. Oman has hosted round after round of indirect talks between Washington and Tehran since early last year. Back in April of last year, the very first round of these talks took place in Muscat, mediated by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Aragchi himself. A second round followed in Rome. A third followed in Muscat, again. Each one edged closer to some kind of framework, without ever fully closing the gap between the two sides. By March of this year, those slow-moving talks were blown apart entirely, when Israeli and American strikes killed Iran's supreme leader and ignited full-scale war. It took months of fighting and eventually a formal ceasefire in April before diplomacy found its footing again. In June, a 14-point memorandum of understanding was finally signed between Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. Trump signed it during a dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Palace of Versailles, following the G7 summit. It was framed as a genuine turning point. 60 days of talks were supposed to follow, aimed at resolving everything from the Strait of Hormuz to Iran's nuclear stockpile once and for all. Instead, only 2 rounds of high-level direct talks ever took place. Lower-level technical negotiations continued in the background, quietly, until the strikes on commercial tankers this month tore the fragile process open again. That is the exact deal Trump has now called over. That is the exact process Araghchi is trying to salvage with this trip to Oman. And that is why so much weight is being placed on a single foreign minister boarding a single flight to Muscat. Because if this specific channel collapses, the region doesn't just go back to where it was in June. It goes back to where it was in February, when the war first began with the killing of a supreme leader and a full closure of one of the most important waterways on Earth. Nobody in the region wants to relive that, but nobody has found a way to guarantee it won't happen again either. So as Araghchi lands in Muscat, the eyes watching him extend far beyond Tehran and Washington. They stretch to Moscow, tracking how this war continues to reshape global oil markets in Russia's favor. They stretch to Beijing, calculating how much diplomatic capital it can gain by appearing as the responsible power while others fight. They stretch to European capitals, still nervously watching oil prices and shipping routes they depend on just as much as anyone else. And they stretch to ordinary people across Asia and the Gulf, still living with fuel shortages and price spikes triggered by a war most of them never had any say in. There's another piece of this puzzle that rarely makes headlines, but sits at the very center of why these Oman talks matter so much. Since the early weeks of this war, Iran has operated what maritime analysts have started calling a toll booth system across the Strait of Hormuz. Ships willing to pay Iran directly have, at times, been allowed safe passage. Ships tied to the United States, Israel, or their allies have not. Iran's own Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps effectively decided who could move through one of the most vital waterways on the planet and who couldn't. Iran's parliament has even moved to formalize these controls into law, treating the strait as something closer to Iranian territory to manage and monetize, rather than a shared international passage. The United States has firmly rejected that entire framework. Washington's own Secretary of State has said publicly that any tolling system in the strait would make a diplomatic deal with Iran completely unfeasible. That single disagreement over who controls access to Hormuz and who profits from it sits underneath almost every other issue on the table in Muscat right now. It's not just about safety. It's about sovereignty, control, and money, all tied to the same stretch of water. Tensions around Oman's exact role in all of this have boiled over before, too. At one particularly heated point earlier this year, reports emerged that Trump had privately threatened to, in his words, blow up Oman itself, frustrated that talks had stalled and accusing Muscat of facilitating Iran's toll collection efforts. The U.S. reportedly warned Oman directly not to help Iran formalize any toll system through the strait. Oman, for its part, has continued walking an extraordinarily careful line, hosting both sides, angering neither completely and insisting that dialogue remains the only realistic path forward. That is the tightrope Araghchi is stepping onto again this weekend, in a country whose own leadership has already been threatened, at least rhetorically, by the American president himself. It's a reminder that this entire diplomatic effort is being built on ground that has already cracked more than once. So what actually happens next depends on things that are almost impossible to predict from the outside. Does Iran issue the public statement Washington is waiting for, declaring Hormuz open and safe for all commercial traffic? Does Araghchi come back from Muscat with something concrete, or just another round of vague language about continued consultations? Does Trump treat any small step forward as enough to quietly extend the ceasefire? Or does he view continued Iranian toll enforcement as proof the deal is already dead? Nobody outside that meeting room actually knows yet. What we do know is the pattern this war has followed since the very beginning. Talks stall, tensions spike, strikes resume, mediators scramble, a fragile pause returns, and then weeks or months later the same cycle starts again. Right now, the world is watching to see whether this particular round in Oman breaks that cycle, or simply becomes its latest chapter. If it succeeds, even partially, it could mean tankers finally moving through Hormuz without fear, oil markets stabilizing, and a war that has already reshaped global energy flows finally winding down towards something resembling peace. If it fails, the alternative is already sitting there, waiting. More strikes, more retaliation, more of the same warnings arriving just before the next disaster. The exact pattern this war has repeated again and again since the moment it started back in February. A single flight to Muscat won't decide everything on its own, but it may decide whether the next chapter of this war is written in a conference room or on a battlefield. And for now, that is exactly why the entire world is watching one quiet visit to Oman as closely as it's watching anything else happening in this war right now. It also helps to understand just how personal this conflict has become for the leaders steering it. Trump himself has spoken openly about the danger he now faces personally because of this war. Standing before reporters at a NATO summit in Turkey, he acknowledged that Iran wants him dead and said he had learned that morning he was near the top of their target list. He called the people behind these threats evil and said the danger needed to be cut out early, comparing it to catching a cancer before it spreads. That single moment captured just how far this conflict has traveled, from a geopolitical dispute over nuclear enrichment and shipping lanes into something that now touches the personal safety of a sitting American president. Iran, for its part, has never hidden its motivation. The killing of Qasem Soleimani back in 2020 has hung over every year of tension since. The killing of Khamenei at the start of this war only deepened that anger into something even more personal for Tehran's leadership. At his funeral, mourners chanted for revenge against the same American president now flying to diplomatic summits and warning the world he's aware of the danger surrounding him. That emotional backdrop matters here, because it shapes how much trust either side is willing to extend the other at the negotiating table. Diplomacy rarely happens in a vacuum. It happens between people and governments carrying real anger, real grief, and real fear of what happens if this goes wrong again. That's the atmosphere Aragchi is walking into in Muscat, representing a government that buried its supreme leader just one day before this latest wave of strikes began. And it's the atmosphere Washington is negotiating from, representing a president who is publicly acknowledged sitting near the top of an assassination list. Both sides are negotiating from positions of genuine loss and genuine fear, not just political calculation. That makes any breakthrough harder to achieve and any collapse far easier to imagine. As this weekend unfolds, expect the language coming out of Muscat to sound careful, technical, and deliberately unremarkable. Diplomats rarely announce breakthroughs in real time. They tend to speak in vague terms about continued consultations and constructive discussions, precisely so that neither side is forced into a public commitment before it's ready. But behind that careful language sits an enormous amount of pressure. Pressure from stranded tankers, pressure from Gulf allies demanding protection, pressure from global markets watching every headline for signs of stability or collapse, pressure from a domestic audience in both countries wondering whether this war is truly ending or simply pausing again before its next chapter. Whatever comes out of this meeting, it will be measured against an impossibly high bar. Not just whether it produces a statement, but whether it produces enough trust to keep the ceasefire alive through yet another test. Because this ceasefire has already been tested more than once, and it has already come dangerously close to breaking completely more than once as well. This may not be the moment that finally ends this war for good. It may simply be the moment that keeps it from getting dramatically worse for a little while longer. Either outcome is possible, neither one is guaranteed. For now, all the world can do is watch a single flight land in Muscat, and wait to see whether quiet diplomacy can still outrun the momentum of a war that keeps finding new ways to reignite itself. The stakes could not be higher. The room in Muscat is small. The consequences of what happens inside it are not. It's also worth remembering how quickly this exact region has flipped from cautious optimism to open warfare before. Back in June, when Trump and Pezeshkian signed their memorandum of understanding at the Palace of Versailles, the mood across international media was almost celebratory. Headlines called it a genuine turning point. Analysts spoke of a war finally winding down after months of strikes, blockades, and diplomatic dead ends. Within weeks, that optimism collapsed. Attacks on commercial tankers in early July shattered the fragile trust that agreement had built and dragged both countries right back toward the brink they had just stepped away from. That whiplash, from signed agreement to renewed strikes in less than a month, is the exact reason nobody in the region is celebrating this trip to Oman prematurely. Diplomats have learned the hard way that paper agreements mean very little if the underlying disputes over uranium stockpiles, over shipping tolls, over who controls Hormuz remain completely unresolved underneath them. This time, mediators appear to understand that lesson. Oman, Pakistan, and Qatar are all reportedly pushing for something more durable than another quick symbolic statement. They want actual mechanisms in place, enforceable arrangements both sides can point to when tensions inevitably rise again. Whether that's even possible, given how deep the mistrust between Washington and Tehran has become, remains an open question, but it's clearly the goal mediators are working toward this weekend, even if neither government is willing to say so explicitly in public yet. There's also a quieter psychological layer to all of this worth noting. Every time these talks resume, they carry the weight of every previous round that failed before them. Diplomats walking into that room in Muscat aren't just negotiating this week's crisis. They're negotiating against the memory of Islamabad, of Rome, of the earlier rounds in Muscat itself, each one raising hope before ultimately falling short of a lasting resolution. That accumulated history makes trust harder to build with every passing round, even as the stakes of failure keep climbing higher. At some point, mediators and diplomats alike have to ask whether more talks alone can actually break this cycle, or whether something more fundamental has to shift first, on uranium, on Hormuz, on the underlying question of what each side is actually willing to give up. Nobody watching this conflict unfold has a confident answer to that question yet. What's clear is that the cost of getting it wrong keeps growing for the region, for global energy markets, and for millions of people whose daily lives are shaped by decisions made in rooms exactly like the one Aragchi is walking into today.